everybody. Hi, Whitney.
Hey, David, how are you doing?
I am good, and I'm excited for this conversation, even if it is about pandemics.
I mean, that is the thing to talk about right now, and I feel like Sonny and I will have some things to share that can really help us all understand a little bit better and to feel a little bit better.
Exactly. We can learn from the past. So, without further ado, I'd like to introduce Sonia Shaw. She's an award-winning journalist and author who counts among her many illuminating books, one simply titled Pandemic. And she's here to help us understand what a pandemic is and what we can learn from the pandemics of the past. Thanks for joining us, Sonia.
Nice to be here. Nice to see you.
Nice to see you too. So I guess I'll start with, having written a book about this, what does it feel like to have it kind of come true?
Well, it's very eerie and surreal, but I think that's how a lot of people are feeling. So I'm sort of experiencing the horror and tragedy of it with everyone else, but also having a lot of sort of flashbacks to different historical epidemics and how they've unfolded, and the fact that we're kind of reliving all of that is, it's a very eerie feeling.
Yeah. So at least I guess now we know it's a virus and not some bad air or whatever else people believed hundreds of years ago. So what can we learn from past pandemics?
I mean, it's interesting that you say that. I think that is sort of the big difference I see, is that we understand the transmission and sort of the causative agents of pandemics today very rapidly. Like, in the past, with, say, cholera or malaria, it took hundreds of years to figure it out that, it's caused by this, like, parasite or this bacteria or whatever microbial intruder it is. Nowadays, we know really rapidly, within like weeks of these things emerging, we can understand what it is that's actually causing that. But it's still not clear to me that knowledge is, helping us contain it any better. So that's the trick. I mean, one of the things I wrote about in my last book, Pandemic, was about the outbreak of cholera in Haiti, which was similar to, on a small scale to what we're seeing today, in that this is a population that had never experienced this pathogen, and then suddenly comes in and it just like spreads like wildfire, and it's really this violent confrontation between a pathogen and a new population that's never, experienced it before and has no immune defenses or anything else against it. And in that case, there was a lot of knowledge. There was a lot of knowledge about what's causing it, and, people were collecting cell phone data, and they could see, like, where is this going? Oh, it's going to hit this village next, it's going to hit that village next. And it was really cool. All these, like, cool maps that were made about cholera spreading in Haiti after the earthquake, but it didn't actually help anyone to not get cholera. So there's two separate things here. Like, we have the knowledge that's good, but are we able to actually like act on the knowledge in a way that will save lives?
Yeah. So on that point, looking at past pandemics, what should we be doing that we're not currently doing based on the past?
I mean, I think the thing that always interested me about emerging diseases is that, they take off so quickly that you can't come up with the wonder drug, the magic pill, the shot, the vaccine, all of those things that we have relied upon since, the 1940s when we developed antibiotics. That has completely revolutionized medicine, and it's completely changed the way we deal with contagious diseases, where we don't have to think about, well, maybe we should, clean up our water supply, or maybe we should separate our waste from our food, or maybe we should, all these things that we used to have to do to avoid contagion in the past. We don't have to do that anymore, or not so much, because we think, oh, well, we'll just take a course of antibiotics, no big deal. Oh, we'll make a vaccine, it's, no problem. And so, and I think what's interesting about emerging diseases is when something's brand new, it starts growing exponentially. And of course, our response is linear. So there's a mismatch there. You cannot have a drug or vaccine in time for the first wave of infection in susceptible populations, which is, of course, the most sort of disruptive and dangerous wave. So we saw that with Zika just now, too, right? Like, Zika came through and it, infected a whole load of people, and we have a whole generation of babies who are affected by that. And we'll get some Zika treatments and Zika vaccines, but it's not going to be in time for that first wave. Um, so what really you have to do with emerging diseases, brand new diseases, is you have to think about how to change behavior. You have to have collective action and solidarity for everyone to say, okay, this is spreading using, exploiting this facet of human behavior. Because of course that's always what they are doing, right? Like a pathogen is a tiny microbe, it can't move around on its own, it's completely immobile unless we carry it around to each other. So they're exploiting human behaviors, and that's what we have to change then. So that's what really interested me about emerging diseases, and we're seeing that play out tragically right now.
Yeah, I mean, obviously, COVID-19 is one of the worst pandemics in recent memory, but it seems like you mentioned Zika, infectious diseases like this, even kind of smaller scale pandemics, were already on the rise. Why is that?
Yeah, I mean, I think what first sort of got me interested in emerging diseases also was this idea about these microbes. The pathogens themselves are not, new, right? They're newly emerged. So, for example, cholera lives in it's a bacteria that lives in marine habitats, and it lives there. It's been there for hundreds of thousands of years or more. But we didn't have cholera until 1817. Coronaviruses have probably been in bats for hundreds of years, if not longer. But we're only getting, a SARS pandemic and the coronavirus, the COVID-19 pandemic right now. So why is that? Well, we know that over the past 50 or 70 years or so, we've had hundreds of new pathogens either kind of newly emerged or re-emerge into places where they had never been seen before. Ebola in West Africa in 2014 is another example. We've had lots of Ebola outbreaks in the past, since the 1970s, but never in that part of the continent in West Africa. Zika in the Americas. Zika existed for hundreds of years too, at least. We knew about it in other parts of the world, but it had never been seen in the Americas before. We have new kinds of tick-borne diseases, new kinds of mosquito-borne illnesses, new kinds of antibiotic-resistant pathogens, and the list goes on and on. And so what we do know about them is that about 60% of these new pathogens are coming from the bodies of animals. About 70% of those are coming from the bodies of wild animals. And that's not strange, many of our infectious diseases come from animals, from, ancient encounters with animals, cows, sheep, chickens, all kinds of animals have given us the diseases that, we accept as sort of normal parts of childhood, influenza, measles, all of that. So that's not weird. What's weird is that it's happening so fast now. That the pace has stepped up, and the other part of it is that which we don't talk about enough, is that humans are giving animals a pandemic-causing pathogens also. We've seen major pandemics in animal species already: white nose syndrome in bats, chytrid fungus in amphibians, colony collapse disorder in bees. There's a number of different ones. So this exchange has been going on. That's part of sort of the human condition, living on a microbial planet, is that we share these microbes, and when they come into a new habitat, they expand to take advantage of it, and in that state, that moment, before our bodies can launch any kind of response, they can really take over. But the underlying driver, I think, of the speed at which we're seeing these new pathogens emerge today is because our expansion has reached sort of like a tipping point almost, our industrial expansion has been going on for, the last decades or so, since we entered sort of the fossil fuel era in earnest. And by now we've paved over half of the terrestrial surface of the planet. Just in the last 20 years or so, we've added another 22% of the planet, for our farms, our mines, our cities, our towns, our industrial activities. And the most obvious impact of that is, of course, the species extinction crisis, the sixth extinction, as we call it, with 150 species being lost every day. But for because we're destroying where they live. But the species that hang on, they have to crowd into ever smaller fragments that we leave for them. And that's more often going to be closer to where our habitations are. And that just increases the probability of contact between wildlife and humans, whether it's through bushmeat hunting or wildlife trade or wet markets or farming or just casual contact. The Ebola outbreak of 2014, we know was traced back to a single spillover event, which is a 2-year-old child who's playing near a tree where bats were known to roost. And that child was the very first case of Ebola in that epidemic, and we know that from sort of genetic sequencing. He infected his parents, and they infected their healthcare workers, and they infected their family members, and on and on and on until 11,000 people are dead.
Right.
And those kinds of events are, they're probabilistic, right? So it's not like it's definitely going to happen, but if you cut down the trees where the bats live in the forest jungle, they don't just disappear. They come root in your garden instead. And so when your kid goes outside and picks up a piece of fruit, it might have some bat poo on it or bat saliva on it, and then they touch their hand, they get it on their hand, they touch their mouth. That's it. That's enough. So
That's it. Yeah. So that's the kind of wildlife portion side of it, but then as you were talking about, there's the human side of it, and obviously we're taking big measures in many parts of the developed world with lockdowns and whatever else. But what about places that, you mentioned the Ebola pandemic, with the places that don't have running water or soap or the ability to self-isolate and still feed their family? I'm thinking of India going on kind of lockdown, but if you're a slum dweller, how do you even do that? Is it going to be even harder to contain this virus because of the circumstances people are living in?
I think what we need is a differentiated approach. You don't have one size fits all for everywhere that this virus is going to occur. The demographics are different, the socioeconomic conditions are different. So right now, lockdown is something that maybe, and we don't even know how well it will work, but the idea is that it will work in places like the United States and Europe and elsewhere where, there's a good amount of wealth and people can stay indoors. And what you're doing is you're saving your healthcare system. So you have to consider that there is a healthcare capacity there to some extent. And so we want to save that. So we're going to stay home just to slow down transmission so they're not overwhelmed. But if you're looking at a country where you don't have that capacity anyway, countries in some parts of Africa that may not have a lot of ICU beds and they don't have ventilators anyway. And then also, people aren't able to stay home and socially distance adequately because they're homeless or they're migrant laborers or, whatever. That, lockdown maybe isn't the right approach. It doesn't mean that there isn't other things they can do. I think about influenza in the United States, and the most obvious thing to do, because kids are sort of the main carrier of, they shed more flu virus, they spread it more amongst themselves, and they get
I can
more.
vouch for that. I have 2 kids. I can vouch for that.
Yeah, so they're very germy with the flu. But the most obvious thing to do then is, okay, well, let's not touch our children during those 6 weeks of flu season, or let's make them wear masks, or let's keep them home from school. We could isolate the kids, don't hug your kids. We could make those kinds of recommendations and it would make sense, but it's not sensitive to the fact that these are people in our lives that we need to be connected to. So we think of other ways to deal with it. And so I think I don't know what the answers are in a resource poor situation, like how do you actually stem that, but that doesn't mean there isn't better options. We don't all have to do it the same way.
Yeah. Are there lessons that we can learn from past pandemics about what works? Obviously Europe in, let's say, the 1600s when the plague is floating around, was kind of resource poor and certainly understanding poor. Are there lessons we can learn from our ancestors, or at least mistakes we can kind of avoid?
Yeah, I think more the latter, mistakes we can avoid. I think about sort of cholera in the 19th century when it came to New York, and it took, they had evidence that cholera was coming down the canal, coming down the Erie Canal, coming down the Hudson River into Manhattan. they collected all that evidence, like we've mapped it out, and it's like so clear if you look at it today in retrospect, right? They knew that the water was contaminated with human waste. They knew that would make them sick. There was just all of these opportunities to actually solve this problem, but they never did. And they had 80 years of epidemics where thousands and thousands of people, New Yorkers, would die. And they were, just terrifying epidemics like what we're seeing today. But in the end, when they finally did clean up the water and cholera disappeared for good, it wasn't for public health. It was because brewers wanted better tasting water for their beer, and they felt they were at a competitive disadvantage because Philadelphia had cleaned up their water supply. So, so much is going to depend on the stories we tell about these diseases. I think about cholera in London also, and they, because they thought that cholera is a problem of miasmas, which were, basically bad smells. So they wanted to get rid of the bad smell. So they installed flush toilets, or what they call water closets. But since they only cared about the smell, they installed the flush toilet because they didn't want the smell of human waste around their homes and alleys because they thought the smell would make them sick. So so they started installing flush toilets, get rid of all this stuff, get rid of the smell. But since all they cared about was the smell and not the content, they dumped all that into the River Thames, which was, of course, their drinking water supply. And so after every outbreak of cholera, they installed more flush toilets, dumped more of their waste into the drinking water, and made it, progressively worse. So much depends on how we sort of characterize this disease. Like if we characterize this disease as some political leaders have done, a Chinese virus, then what becomes our response? Our response is then, okay, well, we should close our borders and trade, or do we do we think of it as a problem of, well, too many people are traveling, let's shut that down, or do we think of it as, people are invading wildlife habitat, let's start conserving wildlife habitat so that doesn't happen. There's all of these things, all of these epidemics are multifactorial. There's more than one, there's a lot of pieces that come together. So ultimately, the stories we tell are going to be really influential in the actions we'll take after this pandemic ends.
It's that cultural piece. We just need to get the brewers involved, and then America will take action. But it looks like Whitney has a question.
Yeah, this is so fascinating. We have some questions coming in from the audience. One of them is about, in your point about this being multifactorial, thinking about the climate crisis and how and why might that make infectious disease outbreaks more common?
Yeah, so, the thing about the climate change is it's going to have a diverse effect on infectious disease epidemiology. In some places, there'll be more opportunities for pathogens to spread, certain pathogens to spread, in other places there might be less. So malaria is a good example of that, where malaria is carried by mosquitoes, of course. So if you had, say, climate change means more precipitation in a place, maybe that would mean that there'll be more puddles around, so there'll be more breeding areas for mosquitoes. And so that could mean that there will be more malaria, or there could be more malaria. But it also could mean that there'd be more flooding. And if there's more flooding, then that would wash more mosquito eggs away, and so you'd have less mosquitoes. And so then you might have less malaria around. So the impact is going to vary, but I think the main thing is that the opportunities for transmission are going to change. So when disease happens in new places, that's what we're going to see, is disease happening in new places, meaning populations that haven't had those experiences before are going to be having diseases. And that's, we know because of immunity, when something's new to you, you'll get more sick. So overall, I think the impact will be a higher burden of disease from infectious pathogens, even as, like, in some places there might be less of this one disease and more of it somewhere else. But the other factor is just wildlife is moving. Climate change is already scrambling migration patterns of people and also wildlife. About 80% of the species that have been checked are actually moving. They're shifting their ranges to, maintain what they're used to in terms of the climate. And that's really good. That's like what we want. That's going to help them survive. But it also means that wildlife and human populations are going to come into new kinds of contact in those areas too. And we don't know how that's going to kind of play out in terms of infectious disease risk, but certainly that will also play a role.
Thank you. I'll be back to their questions, and I'd love to remind our audience online that you can leave questions in the chat function, which is that little talk bubble on the upper right-hand side of your window. I'll be back shortly.
So it sounds like we gotta bring an end to the wildlife trade for one thing, but let's turn to maybe a more hopeful subject. How does a pandemic end based on examples from the past, and how will we even know when the pandemic is ending? What would you point to? What will be the initial signs, and what are the quickest things to end?
I mean, I think here in the in the U.S., it'll be, we'll have, once our hospitals can manage the number of cases that become severe on a sort of steady basis, then we'll be able to relax some of our social distancing. And we'll probably have to have intermittent, social distancing a little bit here and there, kind of coming and going. But the way I see it is like, we're in the steep first wave, and it's the most sort of violent and difficult part of this process. There's sort of a new pathogen kind of tearing through a susceptible population. But as it proceeds, more and more of us are going to become, immune because we'll have had it, or, some of us will perish from it, of course. We're going to lose people, but most of us are going to be able to have it and recover, or wait until there's a vaccine, and then have exposure. So, we look at measles coming into North America. I think about that a lot and how violent that was. That was just such a violent confrontation, and, changed history entirely. But then, after those first waves that are so deadly, measles then becomes a disease of childhood. And we see that with malaria too, which is, an ongoing catastrophe, that malaria killed so many people every year. This is something we've known how to prevent entirely and cure with drugs for hundreds of years. And still, thousands and thousands of babies die of malaria every year. And this has been going on year after year after year. But in places where there is a lot of malaria is a disease of childhood. So if you can survive those first 10 episodes of malaria, before you're 2 years old, then you can live in a malaria society, and malaria's not going to kill you. It's much less likely to be able to kill you because you've acquired some immunity. So I sort of see it as a process of slowly getting, sunburn that turns into a tan. You have to go through the pain of that, and sort of get to this level where, like, okay, you can kind of withstand it. And that'll be supplemented, hopefully, with vaccines, so that not so many of us have to experience the actual, hardship of having to survive this pathogen.
Yeah. But what does it look like? So you talked about the cholera epidemic in Haiti. What does it look like when life returns to normal, or does it ever return to normal? Are we typically kind of transformed as a society post-pandemic?
Well, I think that's what's been so frustrating about writing about infectious diseases for all these years, is that things don't change enough after we have these. That's sort of the deep lesson I've learned, is societies undergo these horrible epidemics that are so disruptive and so deadly, and we turn against each other, and corrupt governments can take advantage of it, and there's secrecy. All these things happen, and it's very negative in a lot of ways. But we come out of it and we just bounce right back to business as usual, and that's why pathogens are so successful. In the end, it's because we don't change our behavior. We keep doing the same things, and therefore they're able to continue to exploit our behaviors. I think we're getting to a point now, though, that with this pandemic in particular, where business as usual has been so disruptive, that I think there's going to be a lot more political will to actually get to the root causes of why we're so vulnerable to these new pathogens, and what can we do to prevent them. And there is a lot of things we can do to minimize the risk of pandemic.
So that's a beautiful segue. What are the things we can do to minimize the risk?
Well, so one of the things I talk about in my book is that what I tried to do is show how a microbe turns into a pandemic-causing pathogen. So, starting from its environmental reservoir, happy, beneficial in its own environment, not causing any disease for anyone, and then slowly adapts to the human body and becomes this very disruptive pathogen. So I wanted to look at that whole story, and what I learned is that we really know how that process unfolds. We know a lot about how that process unfolds. So what that means is, while we can't tell which microbe is going to cause the next pandemic, since we know how it happens, we can predict where it's most likely to happen. So, infectious disease modelers have come up with hotspot maps, basically a map of the world where places where there's a lot of invasion of wildlife habitat, there's a lot of intensification of like factory farming, a lot of slums, a lot of flight connections. These are the drivers of microbes turning into pandemic-causing pathogens. And so there's hotspots around the world, and in those places we can actively surveil from microbes. Don't wait until a bunch of people start getting sick, because that's when the pathogen's already adapted to the human body. It's already starting to spread, and it's already starting to spread exponentially. And our response is linear. It's not gonna, we're not gonna be able to catch up. But you can actively look for microbes that might be changing, might be evolving in certain ways, and they do that through, various sampling techniques, looking at blood samples or scat from wild animals, or taking blood from farmers, bushmeat hunters, like people kind of on the front lines of sort of interacting with microbes in this way, and really look and see like which ones are changing, and then you can just kind of tinker with the local situation so that it doesn't have those opportunities anymore. And the USAID was funding that program. It was called PREDICT. It was like a 10-year-old program, and over the course of 10 years, that scientists who are involved in that program fingered about 900 microbes that might be changing in ways that could cause pandemics. And so that's the kind of background, invisible public health work that nobody hears about, because when public health is really, really successful, like nothing happens, so that's sort of, the paradox of it all is like the great victory of public health is that, oh, nothing happens, so the optics aren't great for public health, but it's really important work. So, that's the kind of thing we could do if we had the political will. And then, of course, protecting wildlife habitat, conserving more wildlife habitat, and thinking about the public health impact of development. We think about sort of the environmental impact. Okay, is this gonna, cause runoff or, whatever, we'll look at sort of the environmental impact before we say, yes, okay, you can build that house or that mine or expand that mall or whatever. But we don't look at, well, what is the public health impact? And maybe that's something we can add on. And I think if we did that and we had a really holistic way of looking at how pathogens emerge, like it would have a constraining effect on our expanding footprint on the landscape. And that's ultimately really the kind of deep driver of all this.
So public health is kind of the, boy who didn't cry wolf, and therefore it's very easy to forget about those programs, right?
Yeah, exactly.
But they're the only thing protecting us. Is PREDICT still around, or were we so foolish as to stop?
Yeah, the Trump administration cut it last year, I think, but I believe they had some anonymous donor who gave them a couple $1 million, so they're doing a little bit more. But this is something that obviously we're going to need to beef up. And if we make some new choices in November and get a government and political leaders in place who understand the value of that kind of work. And then, of course, we need to have our, uplift our primary health care so people have more access to care, and paid sick leave, and all of those things, so that when outbreaks do occur, that we don't have the kind of disruption and tragedy that we're seeing right now.
And looks like Whitney is back with another question. I have many more though, Whitney, if you are struggling.
No. There's a couple of interesting ones here. In fact, one that sort of takes things in a little bit of a different direction. One person wrote in about how you wrote recently about another type of pandemic, that of xenophobia and scapegoating. And it's really interested to hear you talk more about that and sort of how we can combat that pattern of harassment.
Yeah, I mean, this has been sort of the hallmark of outbreaks of new disease, since like hundreds of years ago, at least in the history that I've been writing about, that, a new disease comes out of nowhere, people don't know why is it coming, why is it spreading, why are some people getting, why other people aren't getting it, and they start pointing their fingers at each other. During the days of cholera, it was, the Irish immigrants who were blamed for the cholera. After they were blamed, then it was the Muslims who were blamed, and then it was the Eastern Europeans who were blamed. And so today we see people blaming the Chinese or maybe Asians writ large. And of course, there is a geography to where pathogens emerge. But once they erupt, they're global. As we clearly see today, this thing is everywhere. And as much as coronavirus might have originated in parts of China, again, this goes back to what are the stories we tell about epidemics and contagions? When we see a pathogen emerge somewhere else, outside of our society, we talk about it in a certain way. When it's something that emerges right on our own soil, in our own communities, we talk about it in a totally different way. So you look at, for example, antibiotic-resistant bacteria. This is a huge problem in the United States, and it's directly linked to our completely irrational use of antibiotics, not just in human medicine, but in agriculture. We're already rapidly approaching the point where we'll have unstoppable infection. But we don't talk about it that way. We don't talk about it as this scary thing that's growing and encroaching on us, because it doesn't match this paradigm of invasion and encroachment. The others are the ones. They're the other people are the polluted intruders who are contaminating us. And we need to kind of close our borders and keep our pristine, pure societies intact, and keep all this contamination outside of us. And I think that's sort of the general way we talk about pathogens and disease processes as a process of invasion really lends itself to scapegoating, even if you don't have a political leader like we do in the United States who actually actively calls the virus a Chinese virus, or actively kind of engages and encourages scapegoating. I think the general way we even talk about diseases has to change. We don't talk about HIV as the New York City virus, even though it exploded in New York City. We don't talk about methicillin-resistant Staphylococcus aureus MRSA as the Boston plague, even though that's where it exploded. Because we name things as other and foreign when they're outside of us, and I think that's part of trying to make us feel better about it, and also, externalizing the threat when really it's so much about our own behaviors.
Great, and I'll come back and join you guys at the very end.
That, I think, is a very important point in that we're kind of in an infodemic of sorts. There's as much kind of misinformation with this pandemic as as any I've ever seen. Are there examples from the past where kind of the rumors and the bad intel kind of raced ahead of the pandemic, or is that truly a feature of our kind of modern age?
Oh no, I don't think it's a feature of our modern age at all. That was,
well, that's good.
There was rumors and secrecy, and all of that is definitely very much a part of epidemics of the past. I mean, I think a lot about an epidemic of cholera that happened in Italy in 1911 or so, and it was on the eve of the I think it was the 50th anniversary of the state of Italy. And so there's these big celebrations planned, and then cholera erupted in Naples, and the government basically just decided to keep it a secret. I mean, it was still spreading, and people were getting sick and people were dying, but they kind of paid off newspaper reporters not to mention it, and they intercepted telegrams that had the word cholera in it, and they censored those. It was in cahoots with other international leaders, in the United States and in France. They knew, and they said, okay, we're just not gonna, let's just not mention it, and, in the absence of sort of authoritative, accurate information from the top, all kinds of rumors spread. It's people are dying from eating watermelon, people are dying from eating strawberries, people are dying, all different, because you don't know. There's just this vacuum, but something is happening. And I think right now, because there are some mixed messaging. There is some mixed messaging coming from our political leaders, where some are saying, oh, it's very serious. Is kind of the fog of war. There's a lot of uncertainty right now, and so it's understandable. But that definitely lends itself to the rumors and misinformation. Just like in the 19th century when people blamed diseases on Irish immigrants. That was basically a made up idea also.
Right. Well, we certainly saw that early on in this pandemic. China was not exactly transparent in the early days, and that's a feature, going back to the Spanish flu, which is only called the Spanish flu because, as I understand it, Spain was the only one to kind of openly talk about it. But it's thought that it actually originated in the U.S., right?
Yeah, I'm not sure where it actually originated, somewhere in the Americas, but yeah, Spanish flu became sort of, Spain got blamed for the whole thing, even though it didn't even originate there.
So that is a recurring feature. Are there kind of common responses that we have to these pandemics that kind of repeat themselves over and over again that we could maybe avoid next time around? Because it seems like pandemics are a feature of human existence.
I mean, I think they are in a way, but they are also manufactured by our social and political choices. So I think we can't get rid of infectious diseases. We'll always have those. We'll always have outbreaks and epidemics here and there. But we don't have to spread them around the world rapidly in a pandemic. I don't think so. Larry Brilliant, epidemiologist, had this great quote, which I use a lot. He said, infectious diseases are inevitable, but pandemics are optional. And I think that is right. We don't have to spread these around so rapidly, and we don't have to create that. Basically, we're building highways for these microbes to enter the human body, and then we're distributing them around the globe, in the most efficient way possible. And yet, for me, like the spread, the travel network is also part of the solution, right? Because yes, that spreads disease, but it also spreads cures. It also spreads knowledge and innovation. And so, to me, there's all of these risk factors. There's costs and benefits, and you have to weigh those. So to me, movement is so beneficial. Also, that I think that maybe outweighs the cost. But there's a lot of other things we can do. In terms of being prepared for the next epidemic, but also just minimizing the risk that's going to happen at all. I mean, the coronavirus family is the obvious candidate. Like this virus is the same species of the SARS virus that came out in 2002. Right. So, once we can better understand where these things are coming from and what is the exact sort of pathway, we can start to rearrange those so that it becomes less likely that these pathogen labels take it to exploit these pathways we've created for them.
Right, and looking at history, is it that pandemics kind of follow these waves of globalization, or is it more complicated than that?
Yeah, I think that is true. I mean, you look at, cholera is the one I wrote about the most because it's one of our most successful pandemic-causing pathogens. It's caused 7 global pandemics, and I think there's an 8th one sort of brewing, most likely. But yeah, it definitely took advantage of, 19th century travel patterns of the new canals and steamships, and, the industrial age was really something that cholera took advantage of. And, we see with like SARS, for example, in 2002, would never have gotten out of South China and Hong Kong if it weren't, it reached Hong Kong, which was critical because that's an international flight hub, and then from there it was able to, be carried out in flights to like dozens of other countries. And same with Zika. Zika, wouldn't have made it over to the Americas except for international sporting events and things like that. So everyone kind of suddenly coming together creates these great opportunities for pathogens to spread. But at the same time, you can actually predict like where, and this has been mapped out in really beautiful maps where if you have like a map of the world and you simulate a flu pandemic on it, there'll be like a little red dot in one place where there's infection, and then it kind of just spreads kind of seemingly randomly around the globe until everyone's gotten it. If you take that same map and you map out all the cities in terms of their direct flight connections, and then run that same simulated flu pandemic on that kind of map, it resolves into this like beautiful, perfect series of waves, because you can literally predict which city will be infected next just based on the number of direct flights between uninfected and infected cities. So, the way we travel is hugely influential in sort of the shape of these pandemics and how they unfold.
So it looks like we have to wrap up, but I want to ask one final question, which is, you've studied all these past pandemics. What gives you hope from what you've learned, what you've seen?
Two things. One is maybe a little darker than the second one, so I'll start with the darker one. One is that pathogens have to balance their transmissibility and their virulence. If you have a pathogen, and this is just from the pathogen's point of view, to survive, they have to spread from one host to the next, and they have to replicate within that host so that their populations get stronger and bigger. So they need to do both of those things, and that's the tension for them, because if they're too virulent, if they replicate too fast, then their host is going to get so sick and maybe even die. And then they're not going to be able to carry them to the next person. A dead host or a sick host is isolated. They're not interacting with other people as much, so there's much fewer transmission opportunities. So it's sort of in the pathogen's interest to not be so virulent that you can't get carried on, that you end up in sort of a dead-end host, essentially. So they have to balance those two things out. So that's just the way I cope with the fact that we live in a world of pathogens around us, is it's not really in their interest, evolutionarily speaking, to be like really, really deadly. That's why the first SARS died out. That virus is extinct now. It basically just burnt itself out because it wasn't transmissible enough. It was too deadly. So that's something that I always kind of keep in mind. It's just in terms of like perspective, it helps me. But the other thing is, I think what we're seeing today is, people really coming together because we don't have technology. When we have a tool, when we have a product, then we can more easily say, well, I'm just going to get my piece of it. I'm going to get my prescription and my pill and my vaccine and my shot, and then, I don't need to mind what other people are doing. It's not going to matter as much to me. It becomes a very individual response. And I think what we're seeing today is the need for collective action and solidarity, and we're seeing that across societies, with governments sharing information, scientists collaborating in whole new ways that we haven't seen before, global populations collaborating and connecting in all these new ways, and sort of having this common experience, this shared experience. It's a tragic experience. It's going to be so traumatic for so many of us, but we're all going through it together, and I'm hopeful that out of that something good will come for all of us.
Me too. Well, thank you so much for joining us and sharing your insights and wisdom, Sonia. I'm going to say goodbye because I think we're out of time. Is that right, Whitney? Yep.
That's right. Thank you so much, Sonia. It was really great to have you and to hear your conversation with David here.
Be well. Bye, Sonia.
Stay safe, Sonia.